The morning light spilled across the plains like honey dripped from an old tin spoon, slow and golden and aching to touch every dry blade of prairie grass. Clara May stood by the warped fence, her hair pinned high but strands already fighting loose in the restless breeze. In her hand, a letter trembled, Boone Carter's letter, thick with promises written in a hand so careful it seemed to sweat between each word. She read it again, though she knew every line by heart. Awaiting you with an open hearth, and 2 strong arms, he had written. The land is wide, but it feels empty without a woman's laughter. She closed her eyes and let her breath catch in her throat. She'd dreamed of adventure once, of painted fans, lace gloves, and a husband who would speak her name like a prayer. But Boone Carter, the fat rancher with calloused fingers and a stomach that preceded him into town. No, the gossip alone was a new dot in the town square. Martha Bell had already spat venom into the air like a rattler. That Boone thinks he can buy himself a lady like ordering molasses from the general store. Mark my words, he's a beast in gentleman's clothes. The words had spread like prairie fire. Clara felt each repetition like a new blister on her pride. She turned, feeling the splinters bite into her palm where she gripped the fence. Behind her, Eliza watched. Eliza, all soft dawn light and silence, her eyes wide as an unbroken filly's. Clara had always been the voice, the sharper blade. Eliza, the gentle echo. Clara's shame now twisted deeper, knowing her sister's gaze, so, full of wordless understanding, rested on her. At supper, Clara moved her spoon in slow circles through her broth. The lamp above them hissed. A moth threw itself at the flame, again and again, until it dropped to the table dead. Eliza's hand hovered over it, as if to bless its tiny, foolish sacrifice. Across the table, Clara's jaw clenched. He'll expect me to sleep next to that great belly, Clara spat suddenly, her voice thin as a whiplash. He wants a servant, not a wife. Eliza said nothing, her own meal untouched. She watched Clara with a tenderness that was almost maternal, her fingers knotting in her lap. Clara's words rang out against the quiet walls, each syllable a hammer against her sister's ribs. That night, Clara sat by the window, her breath fogging the glass. The moon was a thin sickle above the barn roof, and somewhere a lone coyote called, a sound so lonesome it cracked her composure. She pressed her forehead to the pane and thought of Boone's heavy boots thudding on porch steps, his soft eyes peering into the distance for a woman who would never come. She remembered the small carved dove he had included in the parcel of letters, a bird so delicate it seemed. It might rise and flutter if she breathed too hard. She had hidden it in her sewing tin, unable to destroy it, but ashamed to look upon it. Boone's words had painted a picture of endless wheat fields, a rocking chair by the fire, a man who would wait, even in his hunger, for her to take the first bite. Yet she could not bear it. Not the thought of him, not the thought of the town's laughter, trailing her every Sunday to church, of children snickering behind her back, fat Boone's mail order cow. When she finally rose from her seat, her mind was a quiet field after a storm, torn up, but somehow clearer. She sat at the rough-hewn desk and drew the stub of a pencil from the drawer. With slow, pained strokes, she wrote Boone a letter, words that began as apologies twisted into accusations. Her hand trembled as each line formed. I cannot be your wife. You deserve a woman who sees beyond your shape. I do not. She sealed it before dawn broke, pressing her lips to the paper as though to stitch her last dignity into the fold. Eliza rose early, as she always did. She found Clara already dressed, her hair a simple braid instead of pinned curls. The letter sat on the table between them like a coiled snake. Eliza looked at it, then at Clara. No words passed. There was only the hush of morning birds, the quiet tick of the mantel clock. Clara turned her eyes away, her shoulders shaking with a fury she refused to name. Eliza took her sister's hand, feeling the raw tension running like wire under her skin. She thought of Boone's lonely dove, thought of his words, and felt something inside her, a small light, a hush in a cathedral. Without another sound, she stepped back and tied on Clara's traveling cloak. When Clara looked up again, Eliza was at the door, her small fingers clamped around the letter, her bonnet drawn low. She did not glance back as she slipped outside. The air smelled of damp earth, of beginnings. Her steps were small but steady, her heart a single drumbeat, echoing Boone's name. Clara stood alone, the door wide and the wind licking at her skirts. She felt the sudden hollowness of a house when someone's spirit has gone before the body. In the yard, the chickens clucked nervously, aware of the shift. The first pale stroke of sunrise touched the horizon. Clara pressed her palms to her cheeks, her breath jagged, as she watched her sister's silhouette shrink down the dusty road. In that moment, everything she thought she wanted turned to ash in her mouth, but she could not call Eliza back. Even pride has a sound when it shatters. She watched until her sister became no more than a stitch on the horizon, her cloak catching light like a prayer tossed to the sky. And in that ache, in that trembling hush before the world awoke, Clara knew she had set something in motion that could never be called back. Boone Carter stood on his porch, the boards creaking beneath his heavy boots, each groan echoing across the empty yard like a slow confession. In one hand, he held the small carved dove, its wings smoothed to satin from countless nervous rubs. He watched the dust rise at the far end of the road, squinting against the early sun, as if trying to summon a dream he had no right to own. When the figure came into focus, his breath snagged in his chest. She moved like a shy fawn, hesitant and delicate, her bonnet bobbing with each step. Boone's heart pounded, each beat a question. As she drew closer, he saw her thin shoulders, the trembling hands clutching a battered satchel. Not Clara, smaller, gentler. A ghost of her bold sister. Eliza lifted her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the world shrank to the space between them. Her lips parted, words rising but breaking apart like ice on a thawing creek. Boone stepped forward, his shadow falling over her like a quilt stitched from old regrets. "You're not her," he said, voice thick as molasses, and twice as slow. His eyes darted to the dove, then back to her face. There was no accusation there, only a vast, aching quiet. Eliza flinched at the words, her fingers tightening on the satchel strap, as if bracing for a blow. "No," she breathed, so soft the wind nearly stole it away. "I'm not Clara." Boone's eyes lowered, the dove almost slipping from his grip. Then, with a shudder, he turned and pushed open the door. He did not speak again, but stood aside, offering her the threshold. Eliza hesitated, her pulse roaring in her ears, then stepped forward, into the musky warmth of the ranch house. The air smelled of pine tar and dried sage, a place carved by loneliness and stitched with silent hopes. Inside, the floor creaked beneath her feet, like old bones. Boone moved ahead, a great silent bear, pulling a kettle to the stove. Steam rose, curling around his broad shoulders as he poured water into a chipped porcelain cup. Without looking at her, he slid the cup across the table. Eliza sat, her knees, knocking each other under the table. She wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the heat crawl into her bones. Boone busied himself by the window, staring out as if waiting for the real bride to appear, his shoulders sagging under some unseen weight. The silence swelled between them, thick and breathing. Eliza opened her mouth once, twice, but found no words that could bridge that chasm. Instead, she reached into her satchel and drew out a folded piece of paper, Clara's final letter. She laid it on the table, her fingers trembling as though touching a live wire. Boone turned slowly. His gaze landed on the letter, then lifted to her eyes. For a long heartbeat, they shared something raw, something that stripped them both bare. He lowered himself into the chair opposite her, his massive hands dwarfing the fragile dove still cradled in his palm. Eliza wanted to explain, to tell him she came because she believed in the man who carved birds and waited in the dusk for a woman he'd never met. But her voice caught, and instead, she lifted her eyes and met his gaze fully for the first time. He swallowed hard. I thought I needed someone to fill the house, he said finally, each word a stone placed carefully on a fragile bridge. Didn't realize I needed someone to see me. Eliza's lips parted. In that moment, she understood what Clara never could. This man, for all his bulk and awkwardness, was a field after rain, rough, scarred, but capable of blooming. She nodded once, her throat too tight for words. Boone shifted, his chair scraping against the floorboards like a slow exhale. He reached across the table and, after a trembling pause, set the dove before her. His fingers retreated, as though fearing to startle a wild bird. "For you," he muttered. If you'll stay?" Eliza looked at the dove, its tiny wings outstretched as though mid-flight. She lifted it carefully, cradling it as if it were alive. Her eyes shimmered, but she held the tears back, her jaw set with a new, quiet strength. In that delicate carving, she felt the weight of all his waiting. His loneliness folded into every curve of wood. A sudden movement outside the window caught her attention. A lone figure stood by the fence. Clara, her silhouette rigid, her face a pale flame against the morning light. Boone followed Eliza's gaze and stiffened, his jaw tightening. Eliza stood, dove still in hand, and took a slow step toward the door. Boone rose too, but did not follow. Instead, he lowered his head, shoulders rising and falling with each breath, as if bracing for a storm he'd always known might come. At the doorway, Eliza paused, the morning wind lifting her hair like a prayer. Clara's eyes found hers, 1,000 unspoken apologies trembling in that single look. For a moment, the sisters simply watched each other, the space between them crowded with old dreams and new truths. Clara's lips quivered. She took a half-step forward, then stopped. Eliza clutched the dove to her chest, feeling Boone's silent warmth lingering in her fingers. Slowly, Clara's rigid posture softened. She lowered her head, her shoulders sagging as though she had laid down an invisible burden. In the hush that followed, a single meadowlark trilled from the edge of the pasture, its song a slender thread of hope pulling across the heavy dawn. Boone stepped forward behind Eliza, his large presence no longer looming but protective, as if he had finally understood the shape of his own heart. Eliza felt the choice vibrating inside her like a struck bell. She turned, lifting her gaze to Boone. His eyes, soft and waiting, met hers with a fragile, luminous patience. She stepped aside, letting the doorway frame them both. Boone behind her, the dove at her heart, Clara just beyond. In that suspended breath, the entire world seemed to pause, the morning sun creeping higher, casting everything in a glow that felt like forgiveness and something even more tender. Eliza inhaled deeply, tasting dust and morning sweetness. With a small, decisive nod, she stepped back inside, the door swinging gently closed behind her, leaving the prairie wind to carry away what was left of the past.